The gunshot that tore through the peaceful evening air of Willow Creek sent a flock of startled birds scattering into the darkening sky. Delilah Morgan flinched at the sound, clutching her threadbare shawl tighter around her trembling shoulders as she stared up at the man towering over her. Sheriff Thomas Blackwood's face was contorted with rage, his thick mustache quivering as he shouted at her. "You've had your last chance, Miss Morgan. 3 months behind on rent, and I'm supposed to just let it slide. Not in my town." Delilah fought to keep her composure as curious onlookers began to gather on the dusty Main Street. The year was 1873, and mercy was in short supply in frontier towns like Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. At 22, she had already endured more hardship than most faced in a lifetime. "Please, Sheriff, just one more week," she pleaded, her voice barely audible above the evening bustle. "The dressmaking orders are coming in. Mrs. Henderson promised to pay for her daughter's wedding gown by—" "Enough," Blackwood bellowed, grabbing her arm roughly. "I've heard every excuse you can muster. Your father's debts died with him, but your obligation to pay rent certainly didn't." He jerked his head toward the small seamstress shop with the attached room where she had lived since her father's passing 6 months ago. "Get your belongings. You're out." "Tonight." Tears welled in Delilah's emerald eyes as Blackwood shoved her toward the shop door. Her chestnut hair had come loose from its pins, falling in waves around her face as she stumbled forward. The townsfolk watched with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. No one stepped forward to help. Sheriff Blackwood owned half the businesses in town, and crossing him meant risking your own livelihood. "That's hardly the way to treat a lady, Sheriff." The deep voice cut through the murmuring crowd like a knife. Delilah turned to see a tall figure approaching from the direction of the saloon, spurs jingling with each deliberate step. The crowd parted as he drew nearer, revealing a man whose presence commanded attention without effort. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular frame evident even beneath his worn duster. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but Delilah could see the strong jawline dusted with a day's worth of stubble. When he lifted his gaze to meet Blackwood's, his eyes were a startling shade of blue, clear and piercing as a mountain lake. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Blackwood growled, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "Town business." The stranger's mouth curved into a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Is that what you call manhandling a woman in the middle of the street? Interesting way to conduct business." A tense silence fell over the gathered crowd. The stranger took another step forward, and Delilah noticed the way he moved with the easy confidence of a man who had faced danger too many times to fear it anymore. "Name's Cade Reeves," he said, removing his hat in a gesture that might have seemed polite if not for the steel in his voice. "Just rode into town, wasn't expecting to witness such a warm welcome." Sheriff Blackwood's face darkened with fury. "Listen here, Reeves. This woman hasn't paid rent in 3 months. Law's on my side." "Is that so?" Cade's eyes flicked briefly to Delilah, assessing her with a quick glance before returning to Blackwood. "And throwing her onto the street at dusk is your solution? Where's she supposed to go?" "That's not my concern," Blackwood snapped. Cade's expression hardened. "Well, it just became mine." He stepped between Delilah and the sheriff. "She's coming home with me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Delilah herself couldn't contain her shock, staring at the stranger's back with wide eyes. "You can't just—" Blackwood sputtered. "I believe I can," Cade interrupted calmly. "Unless you'd prefer to discuss this further." His hand hovered near his holster, not quite a threat but an unmistakable warning. Blackwood's eyes narrowed as he took in Cade's stance. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider. "Fine," he spat, "but she has until dawn to clear out her things." And you, he jabbed a finger at Cade, you're new here. You don't want to make enemies on your first day. Cade merely nodded, replacing his hat. Appreciate the advice, Sheriff. As Blackwood stormed off, muttering curses, Cade turned to face Delilah. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting against the harsh sun. He wasn't young, perhaps 35, but there was a vitality about him that made age seem irrelevant. "Miss, I apologize for speaking on your behalf," he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her. "But I couldn't stand by and watch that continue." Delilah found her voice at last. "I don't even know you, Mr. Reeves. I can't possibly accept such an offer." "Cade," he corrected gently. "And I'm not suggesting anything improper, Miss." "Morgan. Delilah Morgan. Miss Morgan," he nodded. "I've purchased the old Carson Ranch about 3 miles outside of town. There's a caretaker's cottage that sits empty. You'd have your privacy and a roof over your head while you sort things out." Delilah glanced around at the dispersing crowd, acutely aware of how few options she had. Night was falling, and with it, the temperature. She had little money and fewer friends close enough to impose upon. "Why would you help me?" she asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Something flickered in Cade's eyes, a shadow of memory, perhaps, before he answered. "Let's just say I've seen enough people cast aside when times get hard. I have the means to help, so I'm offering." He gestured toward the shop. "Do you need assistance gathering your belongings?" Delilah hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves Cade. I accept your offer, but only until I can find suitable employment and a place of my own." "Fair enough," he agreed. "I'll bring my wagon around. Take whatever time you need." As Cade walked away, Delilah stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. In the span of minutes, her world had been upended twice, first by Blackwood's cruelty, then by a stranger's unexpected kindness. She didn't know which unsettled her more. What she did know was that come morning, she would be leaving behind the only home she'd known since arriving in Willow Creek 3 years ago with her father. Their dreams of prosperity on the frontier had withered quickly in the face of harsh reality. Her father had taken to drinking, leaving Delilah to maintain their meager existence with her sewing skills. Now she was entrusting her safety to a man she'd just met, a man whose eyes held secrets and whose holster carried a well-worn Colt revolver. As Delilah turned to enter her shop one last time, she couldn't help wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or taking the first step toward salvation. Either way, there was no turning back now. The interior of Delilah's small shop felt different already, as if the space knew she was leaving. She lit a lamp and gazed around at the bolts of fabric, the half-finished wedding dress on the mannequin, the sewing machine her father had purchased for her 21st birthday, one of his last gestures of kindness, before the drink took hold completely. She wouldn't be able to take everything. The sewing machine was essential, but heavy. The fabrics represented months of saving. Her personal belongings were few but precious: her mother's silver brush and mirror, the family Bible with births and deaths carefully recorded, the quilt her grandmother had made. With efficiency born of necessity, Delilah began to pack. She took only what was truly hers, leaving behind the shop furnishings that technically belonged to Blackwood as part of the rental. She was rolling the last of her fabric when a knock came at the door. Cade stood silhouetted against the darkened street, his wagon visible behind him. "Need any help?" "The sewing machine," she admitted. "It's quite heavy." He nodded and stepped inside, removing his hat. In the lamplight, Delilah could better see his features: the straight nose that had been broken at least once, the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the threads of silver at his temples that contrasted with his otherwise dark hair. "Fine piece," he commented, examining the Singer machine. "Your livelihood, I take it?" "Yes." Delilah gathered her courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. "Mr. Reeves, Cade, I'm grateful, truly, but I need to know what you expect in return for your help." Cade's hand stilled on the sewing machine. He straightened and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Nothing improper if that's your concern. I need a housekeeper and someone who can mend. The previous owner left the place in poor condition, and I'm not much for domestic matters." He gestured to a tear in his sleeve. "As you can see." Relief washed over Delilah, followed by a flicker of something like disappointment that she quickly suppressed. "I can certainly help with that. I'm a fair cook as well. Then we have an arrangement that benefits us both." He lifted the sewing machine with surprising ease. "I'll load this while you finish up." As Cade carried the machine out, Delilah hurriedly packed the last of her personal items. She paused at the small mirror hanging by the door, taking in her appearance. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and tendrils of hair had escaped her usually neat chignon. She looked tired, frightened, and yet, somehow, hopeful. Outside, the night had fully settled over Willow Creek. A few lights still burned in the saloon, but most businesses had closed for the evening. Cade helped Delilah into the wagon seat before climbing up beside her. The horses, a matched pair of sturdy bays, snorted impatiently. "Ready?" he asked, gathering the reins. Delilah took one last look at the shop that had been her home and livelihood. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I'm ready." Cade clicked to the horses, and the wagon rolled forward, leaving the town behind. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Above them, stars appeared one by one in the vast Wyoming sky, unchanging witnesses to the unexpected turn in Delilah's fortunes. They rode in silence for some time, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Finally, Cade spoke. "The ranch isn't much yet, but it has potential. Good water, decent grazing land. Previous owner let things go to ruin after his wife died." "How long have you owned it?" Delilah asked, clutching her shawl against the night chill. "Finalized the purchase 3 days ago. Been looking for the right place for nearly a year." He glanced at her. "You're cold. There's a blanket behind the seat." Delilah reached back and found a wool blanket, wrapping it gratefully around her shoulders. "Thank you. Have you been in Wyoming territory long, on and off?" His answer was vague, offering no real information. "What about you? You don't strike me as born and raised in Willow Creek." "No," Delilah admitted. "My father and I came from Pennsylvania 3 years ago. He was a bookkeeper back east, but after my mother died, he couldn't bear to stay. He had dreams of opportunity in the West." She sighed. Reality proved less accommodating than his dreams. Cade nodded but didn't press for more. They traveled another mile in companionable silence before he pointed ahead. "There it is. Carson Ranch, though I suppose it's Reeves Ranch now." In the moonlight, Delilah could make out the silhouette of a substantial house set back from the road, with several outbuildings clustered nearby. As they drew closer, she saw that the main house was built of sturdy logs with a covered porch wrapping around 2 sides. It was larger than she had expected, though clearly in need of repair. A broken window was boarded over and one corner of the porch sagged ominously. "The cottage is just beyond that stand of cottonwoods," Cade said, guiding the wagon past the main house. "It's small but sound. Better condition than the house, actually." True to his word, the caretaker's cottage was indeed small but appeared well maintained. It was a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney. Cade pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, coming around to help Delilah descend. "I'll start bringing your things in," he said, lighting a lantern that hung by the door. There should be wood stacked inside for the stove. The interior of the cottage was clean and basic, a cast iron stove in one corner, a narrow bed against the far wall, a small table with 2 chairs, a washstand, and a rough-hewn dresser. A colorful rag rug covered part of the plank floor, adding a touch of warmth to the otherwise austere space. Delilah moved to the stove and found kindling and wood as Cade had said. By the time he brought in her sewing machine and first trunk, she had a small fire going, chasing the damp chill from the air. "There's a pump just outside for water," Cade explained, setting down her belongings. "Outhouse is 20 paces behind, kept in good repair. I stocked some basic provisions earlier today: flour, coffee, sugar, beans. Should tide you over until we can get more supplies from town." Delilah turned to face him, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "You've been very kind, Mr. Reeves." "I don't know how to thank you properly." He shrugged, looking almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. "No need for thanks. Get some rest. I'll come by in the morning, show you around the place, discuss what needs doing." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Lock up behind me. You're safe here, but it's best to be cautious." With that, he tipped his hat and stepped out into the night. Delilah followed his advice, sliding the bolt on the door before leaning against it, suddenly exhausted. The events of the day had left her drained, but as she looked around the small cottage that would be her home for the foreseeable future, she felt an unexpected sense of peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, tonight she had shelter, warmth, and the kindness of a stranger who had asked for nothing in return, at least not yet. Delilah moved to unpack her nightclothes, determined to face her new circumstances with the same resilience that had carried her through every other hardship in her young life. As she drifted off to sleep beneath her grandmother's quilt, the last thing she remembered was the intensity of Cade Reeves' blue eyes and the curious feeling that her life had changed course irrevocably the moment he stepped between her and Sheriff Blackwood. Morning came with the cheerful chorus of meadowlarks and the warm glow of sunlight filtering through the cottage's single window. Delilah woke feeling more rested than she had in months, despite the unfamiliar surroundings. For a moment, she simply lay there, listening to the distant lowing of cattle and the rustle of cottonwood leaves in the gentle breeze. Reality returned quickly enough. She rose and dressed in one of her simpler dresses, a practical blue cotton with white piping that she'd made herself. After splashing water on her face from the basin and pinning her hair into a neat bun, she stepped outside to get her bearings in the daylight. The vista that greeted her took her breath away. The cottage sat on a small rise, affording a view of rolling grasslands that stretched toward distant mountains, still capped with snow despite the late spring warmth. Closer at hand, the main ranch house stood about 100 yards away, its weathered logs glowing golden in the morning light. Beyond it, she could see a barn, corrals, and other outbuildings arranged in a rough semicircle. Morning. Delilah turned to find Cade approaching from the direction of the barn, leading a dappled gray mare. Unlike yesterday, when he'd been dressed for town, today he wore the practical garb of a working rancher: faded denims, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and well-worn boots. Without his duster and hat, she could better appreciate the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. "Good morning," she replied, suddenly conscious of her own appearance. "I was just admiring the view. It's beautiful here." Cade nodded, looking out over the land with evident satisfaction. "That it is. Good morning to wake to," he gestured to the horse. "Thought you might like to meet Sadie. She's gentle as they come, and you're welcome to ride her if you need to get to town or just want some exercise." Delilah approached cautiously. Growing up in the city, she'd had little experience with horses beyond the occasional carriage ride. "She's lovely, but I'm afraid I don't know how to ride." "No time like the present to learn," Cade said with the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, softening the hard edges and revealing a warmth she hadn't anticipated. "But that can wait. Have you eaten?" "Not yet." "Come up to the house then. I've got coffee on and I can scramble some eggs. While we eat, we can talk about the work that needs doing." Delilah hesitated. "Shouldn't I be the one cooking for you if I'm to be your housekeeper, that is?" Cade shrugged. "You can start tomorrow. Today, I figure you need time to settle in." He secured Sadie to a hitching post near the cottage. "We'll come back for her later." As they walked toward the main house, Delilah took the opportunity to study her surroundings more carefully. In the daylight, the ranch's state of disrepair was more evident. Fences needed mending, paint was peeling, and weeds had overtaken what might once have been a kitchen garden. "It's a bit rough around the edges," Cade admitted, following her gaze. "Carson let things slide after his wife died, spent more time at the saloon than tending his property." "It has good bones," Delilah observed. "With some care it could be quite beautiful. That's the plan." Cade led her up the steps to the porch, which creaked ominously under their weight. "Watch your step here. Replacing these boards is on my list for today." The interior of the ranch house was spacious but sparsely furnished, with a large central room that served as both parlor and dining area. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while windows along the others let in plenty of natural light. A doorway led to what appeared to be a kitchen, and a staircase along the back wall presumably led to bedrooms above. "Kitchen's through here," Cade said, leading the way. The kitchen was outdated but functional, with a large wood stove, a dry sink, and a substantial table in the center. A pot of coffee simmered on the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. "Sit," he offered, gesturing to the table as he took a cast iron skillet from a hook on the wall. "Eggs and bacon suit you perfectly," Delilah replied, taking a seat. She watched as Cade moved about the kitchen with surprising competence, cracking eggs into a bowl and slicing bacon from a slab stored in the icebox. "You seem quite comfortable cooking." "Man who can't feed himself doesn't last long out here," he said simply. "Learned young. My mother wasn't often available for such things." Something in his tone discouraged further questions on that topic. Instead, Delilah asked, "How many cattle do you have?" 50 head to start, with another 100 coming next month. Good breeding stock." He poured her a cup of coffee and set it before her. "Milk's in the pitcher if you want it." Delilah added a splash of milk to her coffee, savoring the warmth and flavor. "You've planned carefully." "Had to. This place represents everything I've worked for over the last 15 years. Cade turned the bacon in the pan, his focus on the task at hand. "Started as a drover, saved every penny. Worked my way up to trail boss, then bought in as a partner on a small spread in Colorado. Sold my share last year for a tidy profit, which got me this place." "An impressive achievement," Delilah said sincerely. Cade glanced at her, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise at her genuine interest crossing his features before he returned to his cooking. "What about you? How did a clearly educated young woman end up sewing for a living in a place like Willow Creek?" Delilah sipped her coffee, considering how much to share. "My father was an educated man, and he ensured I received proper schooling. When my mother died of influenza, he changed. Became restless, dissatisfied. The West represented a fresh start for him." "But not for you?" Cade asked perceptively. "I was 19 with few prospects in Pennsylvania. At least here I could use my sewing skills to support us when his bookkeeping work dried up." She sighed. "He turned to whiskey when things got difficult. 6 months ago he picked a fight with the wrong man at the saloon. The man had a knife." Cade's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Delilah straightened her shoulders. After he died, I took over the shop entirely. I was managing until fever swept through town last winter. I was ill for weeks, couldn't work. By the time I recovered, I was behind on rent, and orders had gone elsewhere. Cade served the food, eggs scrambled with herbs, crispy bacon, and slices of bread toasted in the bacon fat. Sheriff seems like the type to take advantage of such situations. He is, Delilah confirmed, appreciating the simple but delicious meal. These eggs are wonderful. Wild chives from near the creek, Cade explained. Now about the work here. Main house needs the most attention, cleaning, organizing, some basic repairs I haven't gotten to yet. The previous owner's belongings are still in the attic. Those need sorting. Then there's mending, cooking, eventually a garden if you're so inclined. I can handle all of that, Delilah assured him. I'm not afraid of hard work. Never thought you were. Cade regarded her thoughtfully. You'll need supplies from town. I was planning to go in tomorrow or the next day. Delilah felt a flicker of unease. Sheriff Blackwood won't be pleased to see me. Sheriff Blackwood doesn't concern me, Cade said with a hint of steel in his voice. Besides, you'll need your remaining fabric and such from the shop. Unless there's someone in town who could gather those things for you, Delilah considered this. Mrs. Abernathy at the general store has always been kind to me. She might be willing to help. Good. I'll stop by there today, make arrangements. Cade finished his coffee. One more thing, your wages. $5 a week to start, plus room and board. Fair? Delilah nearly choked on her coffee. That's very generous. It's fair for the work involved, Cade insisted. I'll pay at the end of each month. If you decide to move on before then, you'll receive what you've earned. Thank you, Delilah said, touched by his fairness. I'll do my best to earn it. After breakfast, Cade gave her a proper tour of the ranch house, pointing out areas that needed the most attention. The previous owner had indeed left most of his possessions behind, furniture draped in sheets, cupboards still stocked with dishes, bookshelves filled with volumes collecting dust. Feel free to arrange things as you see fit, Cade told her. I'm not particular about such matters. By midday, Delilah had rolled up her sleeves and begun tackling the parlor, removing sheets from furniture, dusting surfaces, and opening windows to let in fresh air. Cade left to mend fences and check on the cattle, promising to return by supper time. Alone in the big house, Delilah found herself humming as she worked. Despite the circumstances that had brought her here, she couldn't deny that there was something appealing about the ranch, with its wide open spaces and sense of possibility. And Cade Reeves, for all his initial gruffness, had shown himself to be fair and considerate, qualities she had found rare in the men of Willow Creek. As she discovered a beautiful oak secretary desk beneath a dusty sheet, Delilah allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to belong in a place like this permanently. The thought brought an unexpected warmth to her cheeks, which she quickly attributed to the exertion of her cleaning. Such fanciful thinking would do her no good. This arrangement was temporary, a chance to save money and plan her next steps. Nothing more. Still, as she polished the rich wood of the desk until it gleamed in the afternoon light, Delilah couldn't quite suppress the small seed of hope that had taken root in her heart. Over the next week, a routine began to establish itself at Reeves Ranch. Delilah rose early each morning to prepare breakfast, then spent her days cleaning, organizing, and making the ranch house increasingly habitable. Cade worked from dawn until dusk on the endless tasks required to restore the property, stopping only for the meals Delilah prepared. Their interactions remained polite, but somewhat distant. Cade answered questions directly when asked, but rarely initiated conversation himself. Yet Delilah began to notice the small ways he showed consideration, bringing wildflowers for the table one evening, repairing the pump handle at her cottage without being asked, making a special trip to town to retrieve her remaining fabrics and supplies. True to his word, Cade had spoken with Mrs. Abernathy, who had not only gathered Delilah's belongings from the shop, but also spread word that Miss Morgan was now properly employed at the Reeves Ranch as housekeeper. It was a small victory against Blackwood's likely gossip, and Delilah was grateful for it. On the 8th day, Delilah was up to her elbows in bread dough when she heard the sound of approaching horses. Wiping her hands on her apron, she moved to the kitchen window. 3 riders were approaching the house, 2 men and a woman, all well-dressed and riding fine horses. Cade emerged from the barn, greeting the visitors with evident surprise. Delilah couldn't hear their conversation, but the woman dismounted and embraced Cade warmly. Something uncomfortable twisted in Delilah's stomach at the sight. The kitchen door opened, and Cade appeared. "Delilah, we have guests. Could you prepare some coffee and perhaps serve some of that apple pie from yesterday?" "Of course," she replied, quickly washing her hands. "Shall I serve it in the parlor, please?" He hesitated, then added, "These are the Harringtons, Joseph and Margaret, and their daughter Rebecca, old friends from my Colorado days. They've purchased the Miller property adjacent to ours." "I'll prepare everything right away," Delilah assured him, trying to ignore the way he'd said ours so casually. When she entered the parlor carrying a tray of coffee and pie, the conversation paused. Joseph Harrington was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with silver temples and an expensive suit. His wife Margaret was elegantly dressed, her blonde hair arranged in a fashionable style that must have taken considerable effort to maintain on the frontier. Their daughter Rebecca was perhaps 20, with her mother's fair coloring and a pretty face currently lit with animation as she gazed at Cade. "Ah, this must be your housekeeper," Margaret said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How fortunate you found someone so quickly." "Indeed," Cade replied, taking the tray from Delilah. "Miss Morgan, allow me to introduce the Harringtons." Delilah nodded politely. "A pleasure to meet you all. Please enjoy the refreshments." "Thank you, my dear," Joseph said kindly. "Cade tells us you're quite accomplished with a needle. Perhaps you might consider taking on some work for my wife and daughter. We've yet to find a suitable seamstress in these parts." Before Delilah could respond, Rebecca spoke up. "Oh, that would be wonderful. I've brought patterns from Denver, but no one to execute them properly. Could you make a riding habit, Miss Morgan? Something fashionable but practical." "I'd be happy to discuss it," Delilah replied, aware of her position but unwilling to appear servile. "Perhaps once you're settled, you could call again with your patterns and fabric preferences." Rebecca beamed. "Excellent. I shall look forward to it. If you'll excuse me," Delilah said, "I have bread in the kitchen that requires attention." As she left the parlor, she heard Margaret's lowered voice. "She seems quite refined for a housekeeper, Cade. Where did you find her?" Delilah didn't wait to hear Cade's response, returning to her bread dough with perhaps more vigor than necessary. The Harringtons' arrival had unexpectedly disturbed the peaceful routine she'd begun to enjoy. Particularly the lovely Rebecca, whose obvious interest in Cade was apparent even in their brief interaction. Not that it should matter to her. Cade was her employer, nothing more. If he chose to court the beautiful daughter of his friend, it was certainly none of her concern. Still, when the visitors finally departed 2 hours later, Delilah found herself listening more attentively than she should have for any mention of future visits. Cade returned to the kitchen, where she was preparing supper. "Thank you for the refreshments," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "The Harringtons were impressed with your pie." They seem like nice people, Delilah replied neutrally, focusing on chopping vegetables for the stew. They are. Joseph gave me my first real chance in the cattle business. Took me on as a partner when others wouldn't consider it. He studied her for a moment. Rebecca was serious about the riding habit. She'll likely call on you soon. I'll be happy to accommodate her. Delilah kept her tone professional. Will they be frequent visitors, do you think? Something like amusement flickered in Cade's eyes. Probably. Joseph wants our ranches to work together on several projects. And Rebecca. He trailed off, shrugging slightly. She seems quite taken with you, Delilah observed, immediately regretting the comment. To her surprise, Cade laughed. Rebecca is taken with any eligible bachelor within 50 miles. Last year it was the banker's son in Denver. Before that, a lieutenant at Fort Collins. He shook his head. Joseph has been trying to marry her off for 2 years without success. Oh, Delilah wasn't sure why this information pleased her so much. I see. Besides, Cade added, reaching past her to snag a piece of carrot from the cutting board, she's not my type. Delilah raised an eyebrow. And what is your type, Mr. Reeves? Their eyes met, and for a moment something electric passed between them. Then Cade straightened, his expression becoming unreadable once more. Someone with substance, he said quietly. Someone who understands that pretty dresses and social connections aren't what matter out here. He moved toward the door. I need to check on that new calf. Supper at the usual time. Yes, Delilah managed, her heart beating a little faster than normal. The usual time. After he left, she stood staring at the vegetables for several minutes, trying to make sense of the strange feelings stirring within her. It wouldn't do to develop an attachment to Cade Reeves. She had plans to save money, perhaps open her own shop in a larger town like Cheyenne or Denver. A man, even one as intriguing as Cade, had no place in those plans. And yet, as she continued preparing their meal, Delilah couldn't help remembering the intensity in his blue eyes when he'd said, someone with substance, and the way he'd looked directly at her as he said it. June blossomed into July, bringing longer days and the occasional afternoon thunderstorm to break the heat. The ranch house had been transformed under Delilah's care, with clean windows allowing sunlight to pour into freshly arranged rooms. She discovered hidden treasures among the previous owner's abandoned possessions: fine china, good quality linens, and a collection of leather-bound books that now occupied a prominent place in the parlor. Cade had noticed and appreciated each improvement, sometimes with a word of thanks, other times with just a nod and a rare smile. He'd begun spending more evenings in the parlor after supper, reading by lamplight while Delilah worked on sewing projects. The silence between them had gradually become comfortable rather than awkward, occasionally broken by discussion of books or plans for the ranch. True to her prediction, Rebecca Harrington had indeed called several times, ostensibly to discuss her riding habit, but clearly hoping to encounter Cade during her visits. Delilah had been unfailingly polite while maintaining a professional distance, aware of the social gulf between them, despite Rebecca's friendly overtures. On a particularly warm morning in mid-July, Delilah was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard the now familiar sound of approaching riders. Shielding her eyes against the sun, she was surprised to see not the Harringtons, but Sheriff Blackwood and 2 other men she recognized from town. Her stomach clenched with apprehension. Cade had ridden out at dawn to check on the herd in the north pasture and wasn't expected back until midday. Squaring her shoulders, Delilah moved to the front of the house to meet the unwelcome visitors. "Sheriff," she acknowledged coolly as the men dismounted. "What brings you out this way?" Blackwood's gaze swept over her with undisguised contempt. Ranch business, Miss Morgan. Is Reeves around, Mr. Reeves is checking the herd. He should return shortly. She deliberately didn't invite them inside. I can offer you water for yourselves and your horses while you wait. That won't be necessary, Blackwood said, his tone dismissive. We'll just have a look around while we wait. Delilah stepped forward, blocking his path to the porch. I'm afraid I can't allow that without Mr. Reeves' permission. This is private property. The two men with Blackwood exchanged glances. One of them, Davis, the saloon owner, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. Getting mighty high and mighty for a woman living off a man's charity, ain't you? I am employed here, Mr. Davis, not receiving charity, Delilah replied evenly. And as a representative of Mr. Reeves in his absence, I must insist you state your business or leave. Blackwood's face darkened with anger. Listen here, you little, I'd consider my next words very carefully if I were you, Sheriff. The men turned to find Cade approaching on horseback, his expression dangerously calm. He dismounted in one fluid motion, handing the reins to Delilah with a reassuring nod before facing Blackwood. To what do I owe this visit? He asked, his posture relaxed but alert. Blackwood seemed to reconsider whatever he'd been about to say to Delilah. Cattle business, Reeves. Two of Carson's old hands claim you've got some of their employer's stock mixed in with yours. They're prepared to swear to it in court. Is that so? Cade's voice remained even, but Delilah noticed how his hand rested casually near his holster. Interesting, considering Carson sold me his entire herd along with the property. I have the bill of sale in the house. Papers can be forged, Davis interjected. We're here to inspect your herd, make sure everything's properly branded. On whose authority? Cade asked mildly. Blackwood puffed up his chest. Mine. As sheriff of Willow Creek, your jurisdiction ends at the town limits, Cade interrupted. This is county territory. If you have concerns about cattle theft, you should be speaking to the county sheriff. Now see here, Blackwood began, but Cade cut him off again. No, you see here, Blackwood. I know exactly what this is about. You're still sore that I interfered with your bullying of Miss Morgan. Now you think you can come onto my land and make accusations without proof. Cade's voice hardened. You're mistaken. The tension in the air was palpable. Delilah held her breath, acutely aware of how quickly such confrontations could turn deadly in the territories. You're making a mistake, Reeves, Blackwood growled. I've got friends in this county, important friends. So do I, Cade replied calmly. Including Joseph Harrington, who just happens to sit on the Territorial Governor's Advisory Council. I wonder what he'd think of a town sheriff overstepping his authority to harass a legitimate business owner. At the mention of Harrington's name, both Davis and the third man shifted uncomfortably. Blackwood's face flushed with anger, but he clearly recognized the threat. This isn't over, he said finally, turning back to his horse. Actually, it is, Cade replied. Unless you'd like me to make a formal complaint to the county authorities about harassment and attempted intimidation. Blackwood glared but said nothing more. The three men mounted their horses and rode away, dust billowing behind them. Once they were out of sight, Delilah released the breath she'd been holding. I'm sorry, she said. I tried to send them away, but you did exactly right, Cade assured her, taking the reins of his horse back from her hands. Their fingers brushed briefly, and Delilah felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. Blackwood's a bully who doesn't like being stood up to. He thought he could catch me off guard. Will he cause more trouble, do you think? Cade considered this as they walked toward the barn. Possibly, but not directly. He knows I wasn't bluffing about Harrington's connections. More likely he'll try to make things difficult in town, spreading rumors, that sort of thing. I'm afraid I've brought this trouble to your door, Delilah said quietly. Perhaps it would be better if I— Don't even think it, Cade interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. Blackwood was looking for an excuse to cause problems from the moment I arrived in town. If it hadn't been you, it would have been something else. He hesitated, then added, "Besides, I've grown rather accustomed to having you around." The simple admission warmed Delilah more than it should have. "Thank you," she said softly. "I've grown accustomed to being here as well." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Delilah thought Cade might say something more. Instead, he simply nodded and led his horse into the barn. That evening, as they sat in the parlor after supper, Cade reading a newspaper, Delilah working on Rebecca's riding habit, the comfortable silence was broken by the sound of distant thunder. "Storm's coming," Cade observed, folding the paper. "Might be a big one, judging by those clouds earlier." Delilah set aside her sewing. "Should I check that all the windows are secured?" "I'll do it," Cade said, rising. "You've been working all day." As he moved around the house, closing windows and checking latches, Delilah found herself watching him with a new awareness. The confrontation with Blackwood had revealed a protective side of Cade that touched her deeply. No one had stood up for her that way since her father's early days in Willow Creek, before the drink took hold. The storm broke just as Cade finished securing the house. Rain lashed against the windows and lightning illuminated the darkened landscape in brilliant flashes. When a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house, Delilah couldn't suppress a small gasp. "Not fond of storms?" Cade asked, returning to the parlor. "Not these western storms," she admitted. "They're more intense than what I was used to back east." Cade nodded, stoking the fire in the hearth to ward off the sudden chill that had accompanied the rain. "They can be powerful, all right, but necessary. The land needs the water." Another flash of lightning, followed almost immediately by a deafening crash of thunder, made Delilah jump. Cade glanced at her with concern. "Perhaps you should stay here tonight," he suggested. "The path to your cottage will be a river of mud by now, and that lightning's striking close." Delilah hesitated. The propriety of staying overnight in the main house, alone with Cade, was questionable at best, and yet the thought of making her way to the cottage in this weather was genuinely frightening. "I wouldn't want to impose," she said uncertainly. "It's not an imposition," Cade assured her. "There are 3 bedrooms upstairs. You can take whichever you prefer. I've been sleeping in the one at the end of the hall." Still, Delilah wavered. "What would people think if they knew? Who would know?" Cade countered reasonably. "Besides, you're my employee. There's nothing improper about providing you safe shelter during a dangerous storm." He was right, of course, but Delilah couldn't help feeling that staying under the same roof overnight crossed some invisible line in their relationship, one that, if she were honest with herself, she both feared and longed to cross. "All right," she agreed finally. "Thank you." The wind howled around the eaves as they prepared for the night. Cade showed Delilah to the largest bedroom, which she had cleaned and prepared weeks ago but never occupied. The large 4-poster bed was made up with fresh linens, and a small fire in the hearth took the edge off the storm's chill. "There should be everything you need," Cade said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Extra blankets in the chest if you get cold." "Thank you," Delilah replied, equally uncomfortable with the situation despite its practical necessity. "Well then, good night." He turned to go, then paused. "Delilah, yes, I meant what I said earlier about being accustomed to having you here." He met her eyes directly. "It's more than just the cooking and cleaning. The house feels different with you in it, better." Before she could formulate a response, he nodded a final good night and disappeared down the hallway. Alone in the large bedroom, Delilah sat on the edge of the bed, her thoughts as turbulent as the storm outside. Cade's words had stirred something within her, that she'd been trying to ignore for weeks, a growing attachment to not just the ranch, but to the man himself. As lightning illuminated the room in brief, brilliant flashes, Delilah finally admitted to herself what she'd been denying. She was falling in love with Cade Reeves. It was foolish, impractical, and potentially heartbreaking, but undeniable all the same. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The storm continued through the night, its fury gradually diminishing to a steady rain by dawn. Delilah had slept poorly, her mind too occupied with thoughts of Cade and their increasingly complicated relationship. Rising early, she dressed in yesterday's clothes and made her way downstairs, determined to have breakfast ready before Cade appeared. To her surprise, she found him already in the kitchen, coffee brewing on the stove and bacon sizzling in a pan. He'd apparently been up for some time, his hair still damp from washing, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. "Good morning," he greeted her with a nod. "Sleep well?" "Well enough, thank you," Delilah replied, acutely aware of the intimacy of sharing breakfast in the kitchen after spending the night under the same roof. "You didn't need to cook. That's my job." "You're entitled to a morning off now and then," Cade said, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "Besides, I was up early checking for storm damage. Thought I might as well make myself useful." "Was there much damage?" Delilah asked, grateful for the neutral topic. "Some downed tree limbs, a section of fence down in the south pasture. Nothing serious." He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. "Your cottage is fine, though the path is still pretty muddy. I brought over a change of clothes for you, left them in the mudroom." Delilah felt a rush of warmth at his thoughtfulness. "Thank you. That was very kind." They ate breakfast together at the kitchen table, discussing the day's tasks with a casualness that belied the undercurrent of tension between them. Cade mentioned needing to ride into town for supplies, and Delilah provided him with a list of household items they were running low on. "I should be back by mid-afternoon," he said, rising from the table. "Unless there's anything else you need." Delilah hesitated, then said, "Actually, there is one thing. Would you mind stopping by the telegraph office? I'd like to send a message to my aunt in Pennsylvania, just to let her know I'm well. She's my only remaining family, and I haven't written since everything changed." "Of course," Cade agreed readily. "Write out your message and I'll see it's sent." As he prepared to leave, Delilah found herself watching him with a new awareness, noting the confident set of his shoulders, the careful way he checked his gear, the gentle manner in which he spoke to his horse. Small details she'd observed before, but had tried not to dwell on. "Be careful in town," she said as he mounted his horse. "Blackwood may still be looking for trouble." Cade's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I'm always careful, Miss Morgan, but I appreciate your concern." With that, he tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Delilah to her thoughts and the day's work ahead. The hours passed slowly as Delilah attended to her usual tasks. She aired out bedding, swept floors, and continued work on Rebecca Harrington's riding habit. By mid-afternoon, with still no sign of Cade, she decided to bake an apple pie, partly to use the fruits that were beginning to overripen, partly to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Delilah finally heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by concern when she saw that Cade was not alone. Rebecca Harrington rode beside him, looking particularly fetching in a jade-green riding dress that complemented her fair coloring. Wiping her hands on her apron, Delilah went to the porch to greet them. Cade's expression was unreadable as he helped Rebecca dismount. "Miss Morgan," Rebecca called cheerfully, "what perfect timing. I was just telling Mr. Reeves that I wanted to check on the progress of my riding habit." "Of course," Delilah replied with practiced politeness. "I've made good progress. Would you like to come inside for a fitting?" "That would be wonderful." Rebecca turned to Cade with a dazzling smile. "You'll excuse us, won't you? Ladies' business and all that." "Certainly," Cade replied, his tone neutral. "I need to unload the supplies anyway. Miss Morgan, your telegram was sent and there was a reply waiting." "It's in my saddlebag." "Thank you," Delilah said, curiosity piqued. She hadn't expected a response so quickly. Inside, Delilah helped Rebecca try on the partially completed riding habit, marking adjustments with pins while the younger woman chattered about a dance being planned at her family's ranch. "Father thinks it would be a wonderful way to introduce ourselves to the community," Rebecca explained, turning to examine her reflection in the mirror Delilah had propped against the wall. "We've invited everyone within 50 miles. You simply must come, Miss Morgan. Your sewing is exquisite. You could make valuable connections." "That's very kind," Delilah replied carefully, "but I'm not sure it would be appropriate. I'm an employee here, not a guest." Rebecca waved this concern away. "Nonsense. I'm inviting you personally. Besides," she lowered her voice conspiratorially, "I've noticed how Mr. Reeves looks at you. He's certainly not treating you like a mere housekeeper." Delilah nearly stabbed herself with a pin. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Oh, come now," Rebecca said with a knowing smile. "I'm not blind. When we rode up together, he spoke of little else but you and the improvements you've made to the ranch." Delilah thought this, and Delilah suggested that. It was quite revealing. Heart-fluttering, Delilah kept her eyes on her work. "Mr. Reeves is a kind employer who values input, nothing more." Rebecca's laughter was light and musical. "If you say so. Though I must admit I'm rather envious. I've been trying to catch his eye for weeks, to no avail." She sighed dramatically. "Father would be thrilled if I showed interest in a successful rancher like Cade Reeves, but it seems his affections lie elsewhere." Delilah remained silent, unsure how to respond to such direct observations about Cade's supposed feelings, especially when they aligned so closely with her own secret hopes. After completing the fitting, Delilah escorted Rebecca back outside, where Cade was waiting with the horses. The young woman thanked them both effusively, reminding them once more about the upcoming dance before riding away with a final wave. "She seems in good spirits," Delilah observed once Rebecca was out of earshot. Cade nodded, looking somewhat weary. "I encountered her in town. She insisted on riding back with me to check on her dress." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Your telegram response." Delilah took the paper with murmured thanks, opening it with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Her aunt's reply was brief but warm. "Delighted to hear from you. Stop worried when letters cease. Stop all well here. Stop your uncle passed last winter. Stop have room if you wish to return. Stop love Aunt Martha. Stop everything all right?" Cade asked, noticing her expression. "My uncle died this past winter," Delilah said softly. "I didn't know, and my aunt. She offers me a place if I wish to return east." Something flickered in Cade's eyes, concern perhaps, or dismay. "I see, and do you wish to return?" Delilah looked up at him, suddenly uncertain. "I don't know. I've been thinking about my future, of course, saving to perhaps open my own shop someday. But Pennsylvania, it feels like a different life now." Cade nodded, his expression guarded. "You should take some time to consider it. No need to make hasty decisions." He gestured toward the barn. "I should see to the horses." As he walked away, Delilah felt a sense of missed opportunity. Something had shifted between them: Rebecca's visit, the telegram, or perhaps both, creating a new tension that neither seemed ready to address directly. That evening, supper was a quiet affair. Cade ate quickly, complimenting the meal but offering little conversation. Afterward, Instead of joining Delilah in the parlor as had become their custom, he mentioned needing to review some ledgers and retired to the small study off the main room. Alone with her sewing and her thoughts, Delilah found herself at a crossroads. The telegram from her aunt had reopened possibilities she'd set aside months ago. She could return east to the familiar comforts of Pennsylvania and family. Or she could stay in Wyoming territory, continuing to work for Cade while saving for her own business. Or, and this was the possibility that made her heart race, she could acknowledge the growing feelings between herself and Cade and see where they might lead. But that would require courage she wasn't sure she possessed. Cade had been kind, protective, even admiring of her work. But he had never spoken of deeper feelings, never indicated that he might want something more permanent than their current arrangement. As the clock struck 10, Delilah set aside Rebecca's riding habit and made her way upstairs. Through the partially open door of the study, she could see Cade still bent over his ledgers, his face illuminated by lamplight, his expression one of deep concentration. "Good night, Mr. Reeves," she said softly. He looked up, seeming almost surprised to find her standing there. "Good night, Miss Morgan. I'll see you in the morning." In her room, Delilah changed into her nightgown and sat before the small mirror on the dresser, brushing her hair with long, thoughtful strokes. Her reflection showed a woman changed from the frightened seamstress who had been thrown out onto the street 3 months ago. Her cheeks held more color, her eyes more confidence. The Wyoming sun had kissed her skin with a light tan, despite her careful use of bonnets, and regular meals had filled out the hollows that worry and overwork had carved into her face. She looked, Delilah realized with some surprise, like a woman who belonged here in this wild, beautiful country that demanded strength, but rewarded it in equal measure. The thought followed her into sleep, along with visions of blue eyes that saw more than they revealed, and strong hands that could be surprisingly gentle when the occasion called for it. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with no trace of the recent storm save for the lush green of the prairie grasses that stretched to the horizon. Delilah rose early, determined to speak with Cade about her future before her courage deserted her. But when she went downstairs, she found only a note on the kitchen table gone to help Harrington with stray cattle. Back by evening, Cade's disappointment settled like a stone in Delilah's stomach. Another day of uncertainty stretched before her, with no resolution in sight. Sighing, she set about her usual morning tasks, trying not to dwell on the conversation that would have to wait. By mid-morning, Delilah had cleaned the kitchen and was considering what to prepare for supper when she heard a horse approaching. Thinking Cade had returned early, she went to the porch with a welcoming smile that quickly faded when she saw Sheriff Blackwood dismounting alone. "Sheriff," she acknowledged warily, making no move to invite him in. "Mr. Reeves isn't here." "I know," Blackwood replied, his thin lips curving in what might have been meant as a smile but looked more like a grimace. "Saw him riding with Harrington earlier. Thought it might be a good opportunity for you and me to have a little chat, woman to man." Alarm bells rang in Delilah's mind. "I have nothing to say to you, Sheriff. Please leave." Blackwood climbed the porch steps slowly, deliberately invading her space. "Now, that's not very neighborly, Miss Morgan, especially when I've come with information that might interest you greatly." Despite her better judgment, Delilah found herself asking, "What information about your employer?" Blackwood's eyes gleamed with malicious satisfaction. "Or should I say your protector? Did you know that Cade Reeves isn't even his real name?" Delilah kept her expression neutral with effort. "I don't believe anything you have to say about Mr. Reeves." "Believe what you want," Blackwood shrugged. "But facts are facts. Your Mr. Reeves was born Keith Reed in Missouri, left home at 16 after his drunken father beat his mother to death. Worked his way west, changing names whenever trouble found him, and trouble always did. Despite her determination not to engage, Delilah felt a chill run through her. Cade had mentioned once that his mother wasn't available for cooking, a strange way to refer to a parent. "If that's true, which I doubt," she said steadily, "it sounds like he had good reason to leave." "Oh, I'm just getting started," Blackwood continued, clearly enjoying her discomfort. "In Colorado, where he claimed to have been a respectable business partner with Harrington, he killed a man. Shot him in the back, according to some accounts." "I don't believe you," Delilah said firmly, though doubt had begun to creep in. Cade was certainly capable with a gun, and there were times when darkness shadowed his eyes, memories, perhaps, that he chose not to share. "Believe what you want," Blackwood repeated. "But ask yourself this: why would a man buy an isolated ranch and install a pretty young woman as his housekeeper if his intentions were honorable? He could have married any number of eligible ladies in town. My arrangement with Mr. Reeves is entirely proper," Delilah insisted, her cheeks burning, "and my reputation is my own concern." Blackwood leaned closer, his breath sour with tobacco. "Is it? Because folks in town are talking. Wondering how much housekeeping you're really doing out here, all alone with a man of Reeves' reputation." Fury rose in Delilah, burning away her uncertainty. "Get off this property immediately, Sheriff, or when Mr. Reeves returns, I'll be sure to inform him of your slanderous accusations. I'm certain he'll have something to say about them." For a moment, Blackwood looked as if he might push further, but something in Delilah's expression gave him pause. "Just thought you should know who you're really working for," he said, backing down slightly, "for your own protection." "I neither need nor want your protection," Delilah replied icily. "Good day, Sheriff." After Blackwood rode away, Delilah sank onto the porch steps, her legs suddenly weak. The sheriff was clearly trying to cause trouble, but were his accusations completely fabricated or based in some truth? Cade had never spoken much about his past beyond the bare outlines. Was there more to his story than he'd shared? And did it matter? Everyone had secrets, parts of themselves they preferred to keep private. Delilah herself had never told Cade the full story of her father's decline into alcoholism and violence, how she'd sometimes had to hide the bruises with high-necked dresses, or how she'd learned to gauge his mood by the sound of his footsteps on the porch. As the day wore on, Delilah found herself unable to focus on her usual tasks. She kept returning to Blackwood's accusations, turning them over in her mind, examining them from all angles. By late afternoon, she had reached a decision. She would ask Cade directly about his past. His response would tell her everything she needed to know about both his character and their future. The sun was setting when Delilah finally heard horses approaching. Moving to the porch, she was surprised to see not just Cade, but Joseph Harrington as well. The men were engaged in animated conversation as they dismounted, apparently discussing cattle prices and breeding plans. "Delilah," Cade called when he spotted her, his expression lighter than it had been the previous evening. "Hope you don't mind an extra mouth for supper. Joseph has some ideas about improving our stock that I'd like to discuss further." "Of course," she replied automatically, though her mind was still preoccupied with the conversation she'd planned. "I'll set another place." "Much obliged, Miss Morgan," Joseph said, removing his hat as he approached. "I've been hearing about your cooking from both Cade and my wife. Margaret was most impressed with your apple pie." Delilah managed a smile, noting the easy way Cade and Joseph interacted like old friends with mutual respect rather than a relationship based on deception. "It's no trouble at all, Mr. Harrington. Please, come inside." The meal was a strained affair, at least for Delilah. She served the men roast chicken with vegetables from the small garden she'd started, listening with half an ear as they discussed plans for the upcoming cattle drive and the possibility of jointly purchasing a prize bull for breeding. "The dance my wife's planning has turned into quite the affair," Joseph mentioned as they finished the meal. "Half the county seems to be coming. You'll be there, won't you, Cade? And you as well, Miss Morgan." Before Delilah could formulate a polite decline, Cade spoke up. "We'd be honored." "Wouldn't we?" Delilah, put on the spot, she could only nod agreement. "Yes, of course, though I have nothing suitable to wear for such an occasion." "Nonsense," Joseph waved away her concern. "From what Rebecca tells me, you're a talented seamstress. I'm sure you can create something appropriate." He turned back to Cade. "Speaking of Rebecca, she's been asking about you constantly. I think she's quite taken with you, my friend." Cade's expression remained politely interested, but Delilah noticed how his eyes briefly flicked to her before responding. "Rebecca is a lovely young woman, but I think her interests change with the seasons. By next month, she'll have found someone new to admire." Joseph laughed heartily. "Perhaps you're right. Still, a man in your position should be thinking about settling down, starting a family. This is a big house for one person." An awkward silence followed this observation. Delilah busied herself clearing plates, hyper-aware of Cade's gaze following her movements. "I'm not opposed to the idea," Cade said finally. "But I believe marriage should be based on more than convenience or social expectations. When I marry, it will be because I've found someone I can't imagine living without." The simple sincerity in his voice made Delilah's heart skip a beat. She kept her eyes on her task, afraid her expression might reveal too much. After Joseph departed, promising to send formal invitations for the dance, Delilah found herself alone with Cade for the first time that day. He helped her wash the dishes, a companionable silence between them that she finally broke with the question that had been burning in her mind since Blackwood's visit. "Cade, may I ask you something personal?" He glanced at her, a towel in his hands as he dried a plate. "Of course." Delilah took a deep breath. "Is Cade Reeves your real name?" His hand stilled. For a long moment he said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he set down the plate and towel. "Who's been talking to you?" "Blackwood." Delilah nodded, watching him carefully. "He came here today while you were gone, said some things I found difficult to believe. I thought it best to ask you directly." Cade's jaw tightened. "What exactly did he say?" "That your real name is Keith Reed, that you left Missouri after your father hurt your mother, that in Colorado you killed a man." Delilah met his gaze steadily. "I told him I didn't believe him." "But you're not sure," Cade observed, his voice neutral. "I want to hear your side," Delilah said simply. Cade was silent for so long that Delilah began to fear he wouldn't answer. Finally, he moved to the kitchen table and sat down, gesturing for her to join him. "My name was Keith Reed," he began quietly. "I haven't used that name in nearly 20 years, but it's the one I was born with. My father was a drunk who beat my mother regularly. When I was 16, he came home one night worse than usual. I tried to stop him, but I wasn't strong enough then." His voice grew distant. "She died 3 days later. I buried her and left that same day." Delilah's heart ached for the boy he had been. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Cade acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod. "I worked my way west, taking whatever jobs I could find. Changed my name legally when I turned 21. Wanted nothing to do with my father's legacy." "And Colorado," Delilah prompted gently. "Blackwood said you killed a man." "I did," Cade admitted, his eyes meeting hers directly. "But not the way Blackwood described it. I was foreman at Harrington's ranch. One of the hands, a man named Ellis, had been stealing cattle and selling them across the state line. When I confronted him, he drew on me. I was faster." He paused. "It was a fair fight, witnessed by 3 other men. The sheriff ruled it self-defense." Delilah absorbed this information, searching Cade's face for any sign of deception. She found none, only a weary openness, as if he had finally set down a heavy burden. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" she asked. "It's not exactly something you bring up in casual conversation," Cade replied with a hint of his usual dry humor. "Besides, the past is the past. I prefer to look forward." "I understand keeping painful memories private," Delilah said. "My father. He wasn't always the desperate man you heard about. Before my mother died, he was kind, gentle. Afterward, the drinking changed him, made him cruel sometimes." She looked down at her hands. "I've never told anyone how bad it got toward the end." Cade reached across the table, covering her hand with his. The touch was warm, reassuring. "I suspected as much. You flinch sometimes when people move too quickly near you. I recognized it because I used to do the same." The simple understanding in his voice broke something open inside Delilah. Tears she had held back for years welled in her eyes. "He wasn't always that way," she whispered. "I keep telling myself that." "I know," Cade said gently. "Just as my mother wasn't always the broken woman she became. People are complicated, Delilah. We all have parts of our stories we'd rather not tell." They sat in silence for a moment, his hand still covering hers, a connection that felt more intimate than any words could express. "Thank you for asking me directly," Cade said finally, "instead of just believing Blackwood." "I wanted to hear the truth from you," Delilah replied. "And I wanted you to know that whatever your past contains, it doesn't change how I—" She hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to express feelings she had only recently acknowledged to herself. Cade's eyes softened as he looked at her. "How you what, Delilah?" The question hung between them, an invitation she could either accept or decline. Drawing a deep breath, Delilah chose courage. "It doesn't change how I feel about you," she said quietly. "How I've come to care for you these past months." For a heartbeat, Cade remained perfectly still. Then, slowly, he stood and moved around the table to her side. Delilah rose to meet him, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I've been trying to keep my distance," he admitted, his voice low. "Telling myself you deserved better than a man with my history, that I was your employer and had no right to think of you as anything more." His hand came up to gently touch her cheek. "But God help me, Delilah, I haven't thought of you as just my housekeeper for a long time now." "What have you thought of me as?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "As the woman who brought life back to this house, who faces each day with courage most men would envy, who sees me, really sees me, and doesn't turn away." His fingers traced the line of her jaw with exquisite gentleness. "As the woman I've been falling in love with a little more each day." Delilah's breath caught at the declaration. "Cade." Whatever she might have said was lost as he lowered his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, questioning at first, then deepening as she responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands came to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally broke apart, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "I should have done that weeks ago," he murmured. Delilah smiled, a new confidence warming her from within. "Better late than never, Mr. Reeves." He laughed softly, the sound rich and genuine. "Does this mean I can escort you to the Harringtons' dance as something other than your employer?" "I believe it does," Delilah replied, her smile widening, "though I really do have nothing suitable to wear." "I have complete faith in your abilities as a seamstress," Cade said, his eyes twinkling. "Besides, you could wear a flour sack and still be the most beautiful woman there." Delilah laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Flattery will get you everywhere, sir," "I certainly hope so," he replied, pulling her close for another kiss. Outside, the first stars of evening appeared in the darkening sky, silent witnesses to the beginning of something neither Cade nor Delilah had dared hope for just days before a second chance at happiness, built on honesty, respect, and the kind of love that grows stronger for having overcome obstacles. And in the small, warm kitchen of what was quickly becoming their home, not just his, they began to plan a future together. The 2 weeks leading up to the Harringtons' dance passed in a blur of activity and newfound joy. By day, Delilah continued her duties around the ranch house, now interspersed with stolen moments of affection whenever Cade passed through. By night, she worked on her dress for the dance, a creation of deep burgundy silk that she'd been saving for a special commission, but now repurposed for herself. Their evenings together took on a new dimension of intimacy. They still sat in the parlor after supper, Cade reading, Delilah sewing, but now she often found herself beside him on the sofa rather than across the room, his arm casually draped around her shoulders as they discussed the day's events or plans for the ranch's future. Cade had insisted that Delilah consider the ranch her home now, not just her workplace. "I want you to feel free to change anything that doesn't suit you," he told her one evening. "This place should reflect both of us." The simple statement had filled Delilah with warmth. She had begun to make small adjustments, rearranging furniture to create more comfortable conversation areas, adding vases of wildflowers from the prairie, selecting books from the library that reflected her own interests as well as Cade's. On the morning of the dance, Delilah woke with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This would be their first public appearance as a couple, and she couldn't help wondering how the townspeople would react, particularly Sheriff Blackwood, who had not returned to the ranch since his confrontation with Delilah. After preparing breakfast, Delilah mentioned her concerns to Cade. "I'm worried about how people will view us," she admitted, "especially after Blackwood's insinuations." Cade considered this as he sipped his coffee. "The people whose opinions matter already know you're a woman of character. As for the rest," he shrugged, "let them talk. We know the truth of our relationship." "And what is that truth exactly?" Delilah asked, needing to hear him define what had been evolving between them. Cade set down his cup and took her hand across the table. "The truth is that I love you, Delilah Morgan. That I want to build a life with you if you'll have me, not as my housekeeper but as my partner in everything." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "Is that clear enough?" Delilah's heart swelled with happiness. "Crystal clear," she replied softly. "And I love you too, Cade Reeves or Keith Reed, or whatever name you choose to use. The man is what matters to me, not the name." His smile was worth every hardship she had endured to reach this moment. "Then let the town gossip all they want. We know what we have." The Harrington Ranch was transformed for the dance. Lanterns hung from trees surrounding a wooden platform constructed specifically for dancing, while long tables laden with food and drink lined one side of the yard. Nearly everyone in the county seemed to have accepted the invitation, ranchers and their families, townsfolk from Willow Creek, even travelers passing through who had heard about the event. Cade and Delilah arrived as the celebration was getting underway, the sound of fiddles and a piano drifting through the early evening air. Delilah wore her burgundy dress, which hugged her figure before flaring slightly at the hips, with delicate lace trim at the neckline and cuffs that she'd salvaged from her mother's wedding gown. She'd arranged her hair in an elegant updo, with a few curled tendrils framing her face. Cade, dressed in a dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and lean frame, looked at her with undisguised admiration as he helped her down from the wagon. "You are absolutely stunning," he murmured for her ears alone, Delilah blushed at the compliment, taking his offered arm. "You're quite handsome yourself, Mr. Reeves." They made their way toward their hosts, aware of the curious glances and whispers that followed them. Margaret Harrington greeted them warmly, while Joseph clapped Cade on the shoulder with obvious approval. "Miss Morgan, you look lovely," Margaret said, her earlier reserve noticeably absent. "That color is perfect for your complexion." "Thank you," Delilah replied, relaxing slightly at the genuine welcome. "The decorations are beautiful. You've created something quite magical here." As they moved through the gathering, Delilah was relieved to find that most people were cordial, if somewhat curious about her changed status. Mrs. Abernathy from the general store embraced her like a long-lost daughter, whispering, "I always knew you were meant for better things than that shop, my dear." The first sign of trouble came when Delilah spotted Sheriff Blackwood near the refreshment table, glaring in their direction. Beside him stood Davis from the saloon, their heads close together as they talked in low voices. "Ignore them," Cade advised, noticing her tension. "They can't hurt us." Before Delilah could respond, Rebecca Harrington appeared before them, resplendent in the riding habit Delilah had created for her, though it was hardly appropriate attire for a dance. "Miss Morgan, Mr. Reeves." She greeted them with her usual enthusiasm. "I simply had to wear this tonight. Everyone has been complimenting your exquisite work, Miss Morgan. I've told at least a dozen ladies they simply must commission you for their own garments." "That's very kind of you, Miss Harrington," Delilah replied, genuinely touched by the young woman's support. Rebecca's eyes darted between them, noting their linked arms and the protective way Cade stood beside Delilah. "Well," she said with a knowing smile, "it seems congratulations might be in order." Cade squeezed Delilah's hand gently. "Yes, I believe they are," he replied, his voice warm with affection. Rebecca clapped her hands delightedly. "I knew it. I told Mother there was something special between you two. Oh, this is wonderful." Her genuine pleasure was infectious, and Delilah found herself smiling in response. "Thank you for understanding, Miss Harrington. Please, call me Rebecca," she insisted. "And you must save me a dance, Mr. Reeves, just so I can tell all my friends I danced with the most romantic man in Wyoming Territory." With that, she whirled away to greet other guests, leaving Cade and Delilah sharing an amused glance. "The most romantic man in Wyoming Territory," Delilah teased. "That's quite a reputation to live up to." "I'm willing to try," Cade replied with a wink, leading her toward the dance floor where couples were already whirling to a lively tune. "May I have this dance, Miss Morgan?" "You may indeed, Mr. Reeves." As they joined the dance, Delilah was conscious of eyes upon them, but found she no longer cared. The joy of being in Cade's arms, moving in perfect harmony to the music, overshadowed any concerns about gossip or judgment. For perhaps the first time since her mother's death, Delilah felt completely, unreservedly happy. The evening progressed with more dancing, delicious food, and conversations with neighbors who seemed genuinely pleased to see Cade settling down with someone they respected. Even those who had been initially surprised by their relationship appeared to accept it, as they observed the obvious affection between the couple. It was during a brief respite from dancing, as Delilah stood by the refreshment table while Cade spoke with Joseph about business matters, that Sheriff Blackwood finally made his move. Well, well," he drawled, approaching with a glass of whiskey in hand. "If it isn't the former seamstress, all dressed up and playing the lady." Delilah straightened her spine, determined not to let him intimidate her. "Good evening, Sheriff. Enjoying the festivities?" "Not as much as you seem to be," he replied with a sneer. "Moving up in the world, aren't you? From shop girl to housekeeper too. What exactly are you now, Miss Morgan? Reeves' mistress. Anger flashed through Delilah, but she kept her voice level. Mr. Reeves and I are engaged to be married, Sheriff. Not that it's any of your concern. This wasn't strictly true. Cade had not formally proposed, but Delilah felt it was close enough to the truth to serve her purpose. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Engaged? How convenient. And quick. Tell me, does your fiancé know about your father's gambling debts? The ones he left behind when he got himself killed. The ones you still owe money on. Delilah felt the blood drain from her face. What are you talking about? Your father borrowed money from some less than reputable gentleman in town, Blackwood said, clearly enjoying her discomfort. When he died, those debts transferred to you. Why do you think I was so insistent on collecting your rent? I was trying to help you pay off worse creditors. You're lying, Delilah whispered, though a sick feeling in her stomach told her he might not be. Her father had been desperate in his final months, disappearing for days at a time and returning with unexplained cash that quickly vanished again. Am I? Blackwood leaned closer. Ask Davis over there. Your father owed him nearly $300 when he died. Davis has been patient, out of respect for your situation, but patience has limits. Before Delilah could respond, Cade appeared at her side, his expression darkening as he took in the situation. Is there a problem here, Sheriff? No problem at all, Blackwood replied with a thin smile. Just catching up with the lovely Miss Morgan, congratulating her on your engagement. Cade's eyebrow raised slightly at the word engagement, but he didn't contradict it. How thoughtful of you. If you'll excuse us, I believe this is our dance. He led Delilah away from the refreshment table, his hand warm and reassuring against the small of her back. When they were out of earshot, he murmured, "What did he say to upset you?" Delilah hesitated, Blackwood's revelations weighing heavily on her mind. He claims my father left gambling debts that I'm responsible for, substantial ones. Cade's expression remained calm, and you're wondering if it's true. Yes, she admitted. My father was, not himself in those final months. He would disappear for days, then return with money I couldn't account for. It's possible he was gambling. Even if that's the case, Cade said firmly, you're not legally responsible for his debts unless you co-signed for them, which I doubt you did. But morally, you've suffered enough for your father's choices, Cade interrupted gently. If there are legitimate debts, we can investigate them together and decide what to do, but I won't have Blackwood using this to intimidate you. The simple "we" in his statement brought tears to Delilah's eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Cade's gaze softened as he looked at her. There's something else I want to address, this engagement Blackwood mentioned. Delilah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. He was insinuating that that we were. I understand, Cade assured her, and I'm not upset, in fact. He glanced around at the crowded dance floor, then took her hand. Come with me. There's something I want to ask you, but not here. Curious, Delilah allowed him to lead her away from the festivities, toward a small gazebo at the edge of the Harringtons' garden. Lantern light barely reached here, casting the structure in soft shadows, with the moon providing most of the illumination. Inside the gazebo, Cade turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. I had planned to do this differently, he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Perhaps on a Sunday ride to that meadow you like, or by the fireplace on a quiet evening. But hearing you tell Blackwood we're engaged made me realize I don't want to wait any longer. Delilah's heart began to race as Cade lowered himself to one knee before her, still holding her hands. Delilah Morgan, from the moment I saw you standing up to Blackwood in the street, I admired your courage. Living with you these past months, I've come to admire everything else about you as well, your kindness, your resilience, your quiet strength. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." He paused, his blue eyes reflecting the moonlight as he gazed up at her. "Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? For real, not just to silence gossip." Joy welled up within Delilah, so intense it momentarily robbed her of speech. When she found her voice, it emerged as a whisper. "Yes, oh yes, Cade, nothing would make me happier." Cade rose to his feet, drawing her into his arms for a kiss that conveyed all the love and promise of their future together. When they finally broke apart, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I've been carrying this for a week," he admitted, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small but perfect diamond, waiting for the right moment. "It's beautiful," Delilah breathed as he slipped it onto her finger. "How did you know my size?" Cade smiled. "I may have borrowed one of your sewing thimbles and taken it to the jeweler in Cheyenne when I went for supplies last week." "You're a very sneaky man, Mr. Reeves," Delilah teased, admiring how the diamond caught the moonlight. "Only when it comes to surprising the woman I love," he replied, drawing her close once more. "Now, shall we return to the dance and make our engagement official? I believe Rebecca Harrington will be beside herself with excitement." Delilah laughed, happiness bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Let's. And then, Mr. Reeves, I believe you owe me another dance." "I owe you a lifetime of dances, Miss Morgan," Cade said softly, "and I intend to deliver on that promise." Hand in hand, they walked back toward the light and music of the celebration, no longer concerned with whispers or judgment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Blackwood's animosity, her father's possible debts, the everyday trials of ranch life, they would face them together. And for Delilah, who had once been thrown out onto the street with nowhere to go, that certainty was the greatest gift of all. The wedding took place on a perfect September day, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn gold against the evergreen backdrop of the mountains. Delilah had chosen to hold the ceremony at the ranch rather than in town, partly to avoid Blackwood's lingering hostility, but mostly because this was the place where their love had blossomed. Joseph Harrington had arranged for a proper minister to make the journey from Cheyenne, while Margaret and Rebecca had transformed the ranch yard into a flower-filled paradise. Neighbors from miles around gathered to witness the union, bringing food, good wishes, and handmade gifts for the couple. Delilah wore a gown of ivory silk that she had labored over for weeks, incorporating lace from her mother's wedding dress and tiny pearl buttons that Margaret had contributed from her own trousseau. As she prepared in the bedroom that would soon be officially hers as well as Cade's, Rebecca helped arrange her hair with wildflowers and a simple veil. "You look absolutely radiant," Rebecca declared, standing back to admire her work. "Cade won't be able to take his eyes off you." "Thank you," Delilah replied, touching the locket around her neck that contained miniature portraits of her parents, "for everything. Your family has been so kind to us." "Nonsense," Rebecca waved away the gratitude. "You've made Cade happier than I've ever seen him." "That alone would earn you our support," she grinned mischievously. "Besides, you've promised to make my presentation gown when Father takes us to Denver this winter." Delilah laughed, grateful for the young woman's friendship. In the months since the dance, Rebecca had become a frequent visitor to the ranch, her initial infatuation with Cade having evolved into a genuine affection for both him and Delilah. A knock at the door announced Margaret's arrival. "It's time, my dear," she said, her eyes soft with maternal warmth. "Everyone is waiting, and your groom looks about ready to break down the door if you don't appear soon." With a deep breath, Delilah followed Margaret downstairs and out to the yard, where a path strewn with wildflower petals led to a simple arch twined with more flowers and greenery. Joseph waited to escort her, having offered to stand in for her father. "You're a vision, my dear," he said warmly, offering his arm. "Ready to begin your new life?" "More than ready," Delilah replied, her eyes finding Cade where he stood beneath the arch. He was dressed in a new black suit, his dark hair freshly trimmed, his face clean-shaven for the occasion. But it was the expression in his eyes as he watched her approach that took Delilah's breath away, a look of such profound love and wonder that tears sprang to her eyes. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion. Delilah was aware of the minister's words, of the warm pressure of Cade's hands holding hers, of the subtle scent of wildflowers surrounding them. But most of all, she was conscious of the vows they exchanged, promises to love, honor, and cherish one another for all the days of their lives. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared at last. "You may kiss your bride." Cade needed no further invitation. His kiss was tender yet possessive, a declaration before all present that they belonged to each other now and always. When they turned to face their guests, hands clasped tightly together, the cheers and applause that greeted them seemed to Delilah like the perfect beginning to their married life. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed an army. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the yard, creating a magical atmosphere of warmth and festivity. Delilah danced not only with her new husband but also with Joseph, several neighboring ranchers, and even young Timothy Abernathy, Mrs. Abernathy's 12-year-old son, who blushed furiously throughout the entire dance. It was only when the moon was high overhead that the last guests finally departed, leaving Cade and Delilah alone at last. They stood on the porch, waving goodbye to the Harringtons, who were the final visitors to leave. "Well, Mrs. Reeves," Cade said, drawing her into his arms once the wagon had disappeared down the lane. "How does it feel to be a married woman?" Delilah leaned into his embrace, savoring the rightness of being there. "Wonderful, perfect, as if everything in my life was leading to this moment." Cade brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "Even being thrown out onto the street by Blackwood, even that," Delilah confirmed with a soft laugh. "Especially that. If it hadn't happened, you might never have said those words that changed my life." "She's coming home with me," Cade quoted softly. "Best decision I ever made." As he lifted her into his arms to carry her over the threshold of their home, truly theirs now in every sense, Delilah knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged at last. Epilogue. 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows of Reeves Ranch on a warm June afternoon. Delilah paused in her sewing to watch her 3-year-old son, James, chase a butterfly across the yard while his father looked on from where he was mending a saddle on the porch. At 5 months pregnant with their second child, Delilah found herself taking more breaks these days, content to observe the life she and Cade had built together. The ranch had prospered beyond their initial hopes, with expanded herds, improved facilities, and a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far away as Chicago. Delilah's seamstress work had evolved as well. What had begun as occasional commissions from Rebecca and Margaret Harrington had grown into a thriving business. She now employed 2 young women from town to help with the workload, creating everything from everyday dresses to elaborate wedding gowns that were shipped to clients throughout the territory. The cottage where she had first stayed now served as her workshop, filled with fabrics, patterns, and the constant hum of sewing machines. It was a far cry from the small shop in Willow Creek, where she had struggled to make ends meet. As for Sheriff Blackwood, his influence had waned considerably after Joseph Harrington was elected to the territorial legislature and launched an investigation into corruption among local officials. Though never formally charged, Blackwood had been forced to resign his position under a cloud of suspicion. He had left Willow Creek shortly thereafter, reportedly heading for Nevada. The supposed gambling debts of Delilah's father had proven to be largely fabricated. Davis had indeed loaned him money for card games, but the amount was nowhere near what Blackwood had claimed. Cade had insisted on paying the legitimate debt despite Delilah's protests, saying he wanted no shadows from the past hanging over their future. "Mama, look," James called, running toward her with a fistful of wildflowers clutched in his small hand. "For you and the baby." Delilah set aside her sewing to accept the somewhat crushed bouquet, pulling her son onto her lap for a hug. "Thank you, sweetheart. They're beautiful." James had Cade's blue eyes and her chestnut hair, along with a spirit of adventure that kept them both on their toes. Though only 3, he already insisted on helping his father with ranch chores and had developed a remarkable vocabulary through Delilah's nightly reading sessions. "Is the baby still sleeping?" he asked, placing a gentle hand on her rounded belly. "Not right now," Delilah replied with a smile as the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly energetic kick. "Feel that? I think your sister or brother is saying hello." James' eyes widened in delight at the movement beneath his palm. "Hello, baby," he whispered reverently. Cade joined them, his work on the saddle apparently complete. "What's this? A family meeting without me?" "We're talking to the baby," James informed him seriously. "It kicked me." "Did it now?" Cade ruffled his son's hair affectionately before bending to kiss Delilah's forehead. "And how are you feeling today, my love?" "Wonderful," Delilah replied honestly. This pregnancy had been easier than her first, with less morning sickness and more energy throughout. "Dr. Miller says everything looks perfect." Cade nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. He had been even more protective during this pregnancy than her first, insisting on accompanying her to every appointment with the new doctor who had replaced old Doc Watson in Willow Creek. "Papa, can we ride gentle today?" James asked, referring to the elderly pony Cade had acquired specifically for his son's first riding lessons. "After your nap," Cade promised. "Right now. I think Mama could use some quiet time, and you, young man, need to rest if you want to have energy for riding later." Though James initially pouted at the mention of a nap, he was ultimately persuaded by the prospect of riding afterward. As Cade led him upstairs for his rest, Delilah returned to her sewing, a simple nightgown for the baby they expected in October. Life had settled into a rhythm that satisfied her deeply: the changing seasons on the ranch, the growth of her business, the joy of raising a family with the man she loved. There were challenges, of course. Ranch life was never easy, with drought, harsh winters, and fluctuating cattle prices creating constant concerns. But they faced each obstacle together, their partnership stronger for having weathered earlier storms. When Cade returned downstairs, he found Delilah still sewing, a peaceful expression on her face as sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating her in a golden glow. For a moment, he simply watched her, overcome once again by the same feeling that had struck him 5 years ago when he'd first seen her standing defiantly before Sheriff Blackwood. "You're staring," Delilah observed without looking up, a smile playing at her lips. "Can you blame me?" Cade replied, moving to sit beside her. "My wife is a vision worth staring at." Delilah set aside her sewing to lean against him, his arm automatically encircling her shoulders. "Flatterer, I'm as big as a house and you know it." "Beautiful," Cade insisted, his hand coming to rest on her belly. "Absolutely beautiful." They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, enjoying the rare quiet moment in their busy lives. Finally, Cade spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You ever regret it? Coming home with me that night?" Delilah tilted her head to look up at him, surprised by the question. "Not for a single moment." "Why do you ask?" Cade shrugged slightly. "Just thinking about how different things might have been. If I hadn't been in town that day, if you had refused my offer." "But you were there," Delilah said simply. "And I did accept, and look at everything that's come from that moment." She gestured around them, at the home they had built together, then placed her hand over his where it rested on their unborn child. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be, Cade. With you." He kissed her then, a tender expression of the love that had grown deeper and richer with each passing year. When they parted, Cade's eyes held the same intensity they had the first time he'd told her he loved her. "You remember what I said to you the day we met?" he asked. "When Blackwood was throwing you out," Delilah nodded, the words forever etched in her memory. "You said, 'She's coming home with me.'" "Best words I ever spoke," Cade murmured, drawing her close once more. "Because you did come home, Delilah, not just to the ranch, but to me. And every day since has been a blessing I never thought I'd deserve." Outside, the Wyoming sun continued its arc across the vast blue sky, casting long shadows across the land they both loved. Inside, in the warmth of each other's embrace, Cade and Delilah Reeves savored the life they had created together, a life neither could have imagined on that fateful evening, when a desperate woman and a determined cowboy first crossed paths on a dusty street in Willow Creek.